I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine. He's a trainer, author, developer, and a Magento master. That's Mr. Vinai Kopp.
Cheers, Tony. Wow. First time I've been called a Magento master. I like it. So, how are the slides going to work here? Do I just click? Oh, yeah, there we go. Cool. So, thanks for being here, first of all. Guess what I'm going to talk about? Writing testable code. This year I've got this project where I decided to try and promote testing in the Magento ecosystem because we as PHP developers have missed out on much of the general development inside of the bigger PHP world over the last couple of years by being stuck on Magento 1 for a long time, where there has been some innovation, but not so much in development processes, right? So I'm trying to make a difference and hope, after this talk, you might be motivated to try out some new things and maybe discuss it with others. So I'm always curious to hear your feedback. So please tweet me at Vinai Kopp. I really enjoy after a presentation to just sit down and decompress and scrolling through the mentions. So yeah, please feel free to tweet me. Also, I won't be offended if you're looking at your phone while I'm talking, right? Good. So this was me about 2010, 2011, right? So this is a bit of a story. And back then, I decided, time to go into testing. Actually, it was more like I have to go into testing, not so much I want to. And I'm sure many of you might have been in a similar situation in the past, or maybe you're there right now, maybe because you're changing jobs and moving into a company, or a CTO is suddenly coming back from a conference with all these ideas about continuous integration or other things. Or in my case, it basically was a lot of the people I admire a lot, like Alistair from Session Digital and others, and they really were pushing for this TDD thing, and I didn't have a clue about it, so I felt like, I have to go in there. I don't want to be left behind. So, whatever the reason for you, as a responsible developer, I decided, okay, I'll just learn it. So, chose a couple of tools, read through some blog posts, looked at a couple of video tutorials on YouTube, and actually, for me, it was PHPUnit and PHP spec that I learned first of all. Later on, a bunch of JavaScript testing frameworks too, a couple. But it doesn't really matter which tools, right? I really like to emphasize that the tools are not the important part. It's more the approach in general. And so far, that experience wasn't that bad. It was actually kind of fun following the tutorials, right? Doing the exercises. So who's been there, starting with learning, could I just see a raise of hands, like looking into some tool somewhere, trying to figure it out? Okay. Yeah, okay. Slowly people are getting warmed up a little bit. I can barely see you here because it's dark, right? And the light's shining my eyes, but I can get a rough idea. Good. Cool. So my problem was, in everyday work, I was stuck in a ton of untested code. All the project I had been doing so far, all the modules I had published, commercial or privately or open source on GitHub, no tests. So that's actually the number one issue I hear about a lot when I start working with other people and try to introduce them to testing. Right? We've got all these projects running without any tests. So where do we start? And, common approach is this recommendation. Start writing with writing tests for bugs. So as soon as the bug occurs, first write a test to make that bug, to reproduce that bug. And then fix the bug, which will hopefully make the test pass. Sounds great. Good idea. However, turns out it's really hard. It costs a ton of time. I spent like 2 days writing a test for a bug that took 5 minutes to fix. Honestly. And only because I can't let go of something, so I stay stuck with writing that test, trying to get it to pass. It wasn't a lot of fun at all. The people had lied to me, right? It was painful. I didn't know what I was doing wrong. And that's the point where most developers just kind of quietly let it go. the more stubborn ones kind of start thinking, I must be doing something wrong here. Right? There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. So that's pretty much when this kind of comments start appearing in the code. Sometimes when I'm doing review, that's what I see. And I'm like, yeah, I know where you're at. Hang in there. And so this is what I want to share today is things that I try to keep in mind to keep my code that I write more testable, to make testing easier and simpler. And it's not a complete list by far, right? But it's pretty much what I currently think would make a big difference, right? With the things that like 80% of the effort, 80% of the result for maybe 20% of the effort. And well, yeah, that's basically what this is about. So first of all, we got to stop writing these huge classes, right? I don't know, in the core there are classes with 1,500 lines of code. That's ridiculous. And I've written classes like that, right? And I'm sure many of us have. I mean, yeah, of course, we try to follow the examples others set, and we have to stop doing it. We have to keep our classes smaller to make them easier testable. Actually, it's not so much the size of the classes that make them more testable. It's the things we have to do to keep them smaller that make the code more testable. So here's an example. And it's actually from Magento 1. This time I decided to pick on my own code, right? So this is a module that I wrote 2008, actually. And it's evolved a bit since then, so this is not like the first version of that module. But it's a module I wrote for a B2B client. And it means, it's called customer activation. So the idea is that the store owner has to activate a customer after he registered before he is able to log in and purchase things. Simple little module. And so when the customer registers, he sees a little message telling him, thank you for registering. Please wait till your account has been activated. And the store owner gets an email notifying him about the new registration. And after he activated the customer, then the customer gets an email telling him now he's ready to go and place an order, right? That's all it does. So this here was the observer. It's mainly an observer-based module. And we have 8 public methods that are all for different events. So it basically is an observer for 8 events. And it does a ton of things here. So I tried to make that test, to test this class at one point. And that's one of those places where I spent a ton of time without real success. So given my advice, make the class smaller. How? I mean, it's an event observer, right? What do we do? Well, here's like a common first attempt. What does the class actually do? In this case, it prevents inactive customers from being able to log in. It sends the notification emails. And it also adds a new column to the customer grid in the admin interface so the store owner can see if an account is active or not. Right? That's all it does. So how about this? Split the main observer into 3 observers. 1 prohibit inactive logins, email notifications, and 1 admin HTML customer grid observer. That's pretty nice. Try that. The first one turned out to have like 3 event observer methods. Second one had 2. Third one had 3 again. Now, does that really make the class easier to test? Well, I took a big class of maybe 500 lines and split it into 3 smaller classes, which means if I had like 1 test class for the whole class, then I can split that into 3 parts too. So the classes become smaller, which means looking at 1 class is less cognitive load, so it's easier to understand. So in a sense, yes, it does make it easier, but not really, right? It's pretty rough. It's only like a first step. Marginally easier, but the effort of testing the actual methods isn't really right. I still have to write the same tests in effect. So here's the second attempt, right? Try to do it in a less artificial way. Let's take a closer look at one of them, at the whole, how the code is structured. One way to look at the code is to look at the dependencies. So these is a list of all the classes the observer uses. Right. There's one helper from the customer activation module and a whole bunch of core classes. And what does that tell us? Just looking at these classes here. Right? I mean, that's like all the collaborators. Well, it tells me, for one, it messes with a whole bunch of different areas in the core. And then there's one helper. I don't really know what that does. So one important thing this list tells me is all my business logic, all what my module actually does, is hidden somewhere in the observer or in this helper. Right? It has to be all in there because the core code is just the core code. So probably the module is just using those core classes to achieve its effect. But the business logic itself has to be in one of these two places. So the observer is actually more like the glue between my business logic and Magento. It's only with the part that puts it together. The observer, there's no reason to put the business logic into the observer itself. So here is an old method from that observer. So what happens here is check if the module is active and should be applied. Then the customer session is instantiated. If the customer is currently activated, then he's logged out. Well, if he's not activated, he's logged out. And the message is displayed, depending on whether it's done during the checkout, right, or if it's new registration. So, yeah, it's kind of okay. Quite a lot going on there, though. So here is a version that might be slightly more testable. Same method. What's different? There's one method check if the module is active or not. And then there's one other statement, get customer login sentry about login if not active, passing along the customer. So one thing that immediately comes to mind here is it's a lot shorter, right? But why is it shorter? It's shorter because a lot of the details are hidden, obviously, right? But I still get the same idea of what's happening, actually. So it's pretty readable. And another thing that happens is it's delegating to a different class here. So it's not all in the observer. What's more, it's delegating to a class that has a name, probably, that's pretty descriptive of what it does. It's not just a data helper. No, it's a customer login sentry. Okay. And what's another thing? No magic getter. It uses getData, which is a real method, right? Not a magic getter. So the details are hidden. It uses delegation, no magic getter. Is that easier to test? Probably. There's much less code I have to test, actually. So let's have a look at this get customer login sentry method here. It's a very simple method. It's a one-liner, in effect. And all it does is it checks if a certain property is set. If not, it instantiates a new model. Otherwise, it returns the returned property. In what way does this make the code more testable? And by the way, what I'm talking about here is Magento 1 code, but it equally applies to Magento 2 or to any other code in an object-oriented project. Doesn't even have to be PHP, to be honest, right? So here, what this method does is probably there's some way to set this property, which means the class can be set from the outside and replaced with a testable for testing. That's the important part here, right? Makes it hugely more easy to test. So instead of using stuff like Mage get singleton or Mage get model, make it possible to replace every single class that's used with a testable. Simple enough. So dependencies can be injected, plus business logic is moved into a specific model. So this specific model here has one responsibility, customer login sentry, and this method abort customer login if not active. Let's have a look at that. So once again, this is part of the logic that previously was hidden in the other observer originally. So what's different here once again? it has a number of benefits over the original code. First of all, it receives the customer as an argument with a type, which gives us type safety. With all the magic getters flying around in Magento, we have to add a lot of checks if something is null or not, or if it really contains the instance we're expecting. So having type safety by passing variables around as arguments actually provides quite a lot of benefit. Right? I much prefer the code to fail early with a PHP interpreter warning rather than having to mess around manually to figure out what's actually being passed around there. Then again here, customer get data, customer activated. Again, no magic getter, instead using get data. And then, once again, we can see delegation. Get session, log out. Get display, show login aborted message. Another important thing is this is the important part of the business logic of the module. And one thing by placing this into its dedicated class is it is independent of the entry point into the code. It could be used from a controller, from an observer, or it could be used in an app, actually, in a mobile app. It doesn't really matter. So I decoupled it from where it's called. Right. More type safety, independent of entry point. Once again, any delegate can be injected from the outside for testing. And the end effect of this is it's pretty easily testable. So one way I try to split the classes in this way is every time I need anything done, right? Every time you need some information, just think, I don't care where it's coming from. Assume I've got this class here, I'll just write a getter and put this class there, and it'll take care of it. Add a method with a good name to it, and I'll create it later, so I can continue working on the current class. If you're doing TDD, you can easily use a mock at that point in time. If you're not doing TDD, well, you would have to write the code later anyway. Just put it into a separate class. Just think, I don't care. I won't put that logic into this class. I'll put it into a different class. Right? Delegate. Delegation is the key, for me at least, to writing more easily testable code. I call that IDCDD, or I don't care driven development. Or if you're more of a senior guy, you can also call it I don't care driven design, right? I don't care. And of course, that's half a joke, but what's the result from this approach? It's like class explosion. Instead of one observer, I end up with 20 classes or more. So each of those classes, however, is very small. It does next to nothing. And it's trivial to test. So that's, in effect, one of my biggest achievements, understanding I can split the classes in that way, and I end up with code that's really, testing doesn't take any time at all. So how far can this delegation go? If I delegate everything, each class will do minimal. They have to do something, right? But next to nothing. Maybe they can do one thing, and everything else is delegated away. It can go on until, I end up with a class that will do exactly the same thing as the previous class. So what we end up with is a class that usually kind of wraps a class of Magento. Or maybe some functionality in Magento. It doesn't have to be one class. Could be maybe two classes. Actually, it could be wrapping any kind of functionality. So when I pull in something through Composer, some other library, I tend to do the same thing. Instead of using it directly, I just use my own classes, normally providing some method that tends to be more descriptive for my purpose, what I'm doing currently. And how it works exactly, that's an implementation detail of the delegate. So in the end, I usually end up with a bunch of classes that are pretty much wrappers. And that, in effect, decouples my code from the core. And that is a good thing. Because I don't want to test core code. I just want to test my own code. It's too much work testing the core code as well. Right? I only test the code I own, that I'm responsible for. And by creating this kind of wrappers for the core class, I don't have to mess with anything the core does. During testing, I just replace the core class with a testable, and I can ensure my code works as expected. Right. So one frequently asked question I get from people who are starting with testing is what to test. But normally, that's not really the right question to ask, especially if there's existing legacy code. A better question to ask is, why does the class exist? What's its purpose for existence? Or because normally we don't write tests for a class, normally we're writing tests for a method. We could ask, why does the method exist? And method, well, a method either returns a value or a method causes some kind of side effect. If a method returns a value, that's what I test for. Try not to test anything else. So if you're using something like PHPUnit with mock objects, don't set expectations on the mocks. Don't care about how internally the method works. Just test for that return value if possible. And if it causes a side effect, that's what we want to test for. Question is, what are side effects? So there are two kinds of side effects generally. One would be global state, which I consider everything that might affect something outside of my part of the code. So, for example, file system, writing files, reading files, checking if a file exists or directory exists, database queries, calling global functions or variables. Those might also be used by some other code that's not part of my code, so they're global state. Same for static method calls or static properties of classes, or for forking processes, right? So all these things kind of might affect stuff out of my control, and that's global state. And any change to that is, well, sometimes we just have to do it, right? Might be the purpose of my development, so we have to test for it, but that's a side effect. The second kind of side effect, well, some people might argue it's not really a side effect, but I would consider it to be one, which is calling a method on another object, right? So if a method like this here, calling logout on get session, or calling show login aborted message on some kind of display, that would be side effect. And I can't test for that because this method here didn't return anything. Now, the key to making stuff more easily testable would be, well, yeah, okay, testing return values is easy as side effects, but try to avoid creating methods or classes that do both. If you're creating some class or a method, make it either be about return values or about side effects. Right? And that way you have a cleaner separation, which makes the code more testable. Also, test for exceptions. Right? That's like its own thing. Couldn't leave that out. So that's pretty much what I'd say what's important to test. So to summarize, the key points would be separate your classes into entry point code. It could be like the bootstrapping, could be for shell script, could be a controller, an observer, whatever, right? Plugin. Separate those entry points from your business logic and split the business logic into distinct separate classes that have an important role and name them accordingly. Whoa. Something's missing here. Nope. Slides are missing. Yeah. The end of the presentation is missing. Okay, I'll just do it out of my head. So, hooks or entry points from business logic. Oh God, what else was it? Specific classes. Separate code that causes return values from code that causes side effect. Don't use magic methods. They're just more cumbersome to test, right? On mocks. Don't use method chaining. Don't, like every method that returns this. The core does it all the time in Magento 1 and in many places in Magento 2. But it's not even a fluent interface. It's just bad practice. Don't do it. Instead, write each code in return, each statement on its own line. It's much easier that way because then you don't have to explicitly mock the return type, because by default, most mocking frameworks return null for a mocked method. So it just makes it easier to test once again. And yeah, there's a lot more to be said regarding writing code, making code more testable, but I think those would be like a bunch of key points. Yeah, finally. I don't know. Do we have time for questions? Oh, perfect. Very good. So, any questions or comments? If you found something else was very helpful discovering how to write testable code. Anybody? Nothing? Nah. Yeah, okay. Just let me give you the mic because I think they're recording, so it's easier for the later watchers.
So how much time did you have to invest, sort of? I know it's hard to give kind of a figure, but if a module was taking you, I don't know, a day to write, to then generate, to rework that module to make it more testable, was that a significant investment of time, or?
Right. Good question. So how much time did it take to refactor legacy code into a more testable shape? Normally I don't do it in one step, right? But if I then go back after a year or two to try to make code more testable, I try to focus on the part that I want to change, right? And of course it depends on what I want to do. So, well, at first it took me, to be honest, a significant amount of time. So, and now I can definitely say it's become a lot quicker because I know the steps pretty much. Okay, I want to pull this out, I want to pull this out, and suddenly things become easier. Sometimes I try to write something like a scaffolding tests first they can be pretty rough. Like they just test the HTML returned from a page, and then I start pulling stuff apart. And as long as that test still works, I know I haven't messed up, right? And then later on, once I pulled stuff apart, it's easier to test the individual bits, and those other tests, well, become obsolete, those scaffolding tests. They're like stepping stones to get there. Sorry, yeah.
Hi there, it's Pam. Do you ever write your tests before you actually write your code?
Yes.
And would you say that's standard practice to do it in that way rather than coding it and then attempting to write the test to support it?
Good question. So yes, if you're doing TDD, then definitely, yeah, that's how TDD works. You write the tests first, and then you write the code to satisfy them. If you use the tests to also drive your development to some degree, that would actually be TDD. Some people distinguish between TDD and test-first development. I don't know. That's a gray area, I'd say, but I enjoy doing TDD a lot. So yeah, but that's only for unit testing. There's also the whole thing of integration tests, and what I was talking about today is mainly about there are many different classes involved, and integration tests are. I also write them afterwards. Like, depends. Some before, some after, yeah. But unit tests generally beforehand, always. Anybody else? Can't see. Okay.
Hi. When dealing with legacy code, would you, and you've got a change to make to an existing module, how would you approach writing, and there's no test coverage, how would you approach testing in that scenario?
Right, like, it depends a bit. So if it's really difficult to test, I might start pulling things apart a bit to make it okay, testable, but it feels really dangerous to start pulling code apart without any tests. That's one of the main benefits of having tests, is that it's much easier and safer and quicker to change the code and keep it in better shape. So unless it's really, really hard to test already, I would first write this kind of scaffold tests in some way. Depends on what it does, how to write those. And like tests that keep me from messing up, basically. Right? That test the most important outcome of whatever code it is. And then I start pulling stuff apart to bring it into better shape. And while doing so, I write more tests that are more low level. And then at some point in time, when I start actually changing the functionality, I have to throw the original scaffold tests away because, well, they're failing anyway at that point in time because I'm changing the functionality, right?
Thank you. Okay, can I have a round of applause?
One more?
Sorry.
Hi. I was just wondering, how do you take, so when you're doing your tests for quotations, how do you compensate for the actual testing time?
Right. That's an excellent question because that's what everybody wanted. How do you charge for writing testing code, right? No, I don't charge for writing testing code. I don't even tell people that I do it. I just write them. And it only was more expensive for me to do TDD the first 2 or 3 months. Once I became familiar with the process and learned the tools better, over the course of a project, I think I'm faster and spend less time with tests than before when I didn't have tests. Because once they don't, in the short term, yes, they slow me down. But not even long term, shorter than that, right? Medium term, it makes me faster. Because every change request that comes in, or every time I notice, oh man, I really messed up that, I have to do it this way instead, that gets faster and faster, right? So that's where all the benefit comes in. So I don't quote for testing time or anything like that. It's just how I develop my code. The quicker I can find bugs or bug surface, and the quicker I can change things without breaking other stuff, yeah, that's where the time saving comes from. All right. Thanks a lot. Yeah, looking forward to the next one.
That's what you get for becoming a Magento master. You have to remember slides that we delete for you. We've got another Magento master coming up next, and we've deleted every other slide for him, so I hope he's prepared.